Hi, my name's Benedict. This is episode 2 in my series where I'm talking about very basic theory, how you can make it work for you, and also how it can make it work for you if you really haven't learned a lot of theory. So first video, we went through the very basics of the key scale, and how to kind of cheat if you haven't learned all of your keys, like to play in D or whatever easily. If you haven't learned those, kind of like learning your multiplication tables, if you haven't learned them, now it's easy. If you don't know your multiplication tables too well, you can use a calculator. That's technology. Here, you can transpose. So all you need to do is be able to look at, well, my core instruments playing in C. So that's that one there. We hopefully all know what C is. That note there. And I want to play in D, which is 1, 2 semitones up, so we transpose +2, and then we lock to a scale, which is D, and in this case D major. That's a way of cheating, so you can still play all the white keys like you're probably comfortable with, but what you're hearing come back at is another key signature. It's not actually as good as being able to play in D major, but it's a workable solution until you either learn or just find your way of being comfortable with that. So we covered that last time. We also started to look at building a piece of music. And this is a piece of music which I'm hoping to put onto my next record, so I'm not doing this as, I'll just write some garbage so that we can do a tutorial. This is an actual piece of music that I'm hoping to use. So if you watched last week, or last episode, you'll find that I ended up with really just a couple of bars of music, which sounded an awful lot like this. Now last time I just had essentially the two sections. I had this section here and this section here. But going back and listening to it, it was like, this really isn't enough. I figured that probably wasn't enough in the first place, but it was enough for me to start to say I had something and to start to show you what was important. Now this time we're really going to focus a lot more on the concept of variation, and from that expanding on what we do have. A lot of people really get stuck. They say, oh, I've got a bit of something, and they just think if they keep adding more, eventually they're probably going to get somewhere. And then they get horribly stuck because they don't really know where they're going. And so that's why I'm trying to get across and teach this very basics of how to just use theory so that you can make a more conscious choice, because we also talked about priority of notes, which we'll go into a little bit more later. So I had one core idea there. I did a variation of it here. It was just enough to say, look, I'm going somewhere. I can build on this. But it wasn't enough to say that we had a workable cycle. So what I did was took this, which was a basic chord progression in actuality. So as you see, I repeat that. By repeating it, I'm saying, hey, this really is the theme of this piece. This is the core of this piece. The brain likes repetition. It's comfortable. You look at children's stories, they're chock full of repetition. Now we've got, from the listener's perspective now, a first variation, which is a little different. Brain's going to go, ooh, that's a bit different. But there's enough similarity that it can still say, yes, this is connected. So remember, music, art, life is about a balance between same and different. If everything's too same, the brain switches off. Makes for poor art. If everything's too different, the brain gets confused and runs screaming from the building. poor art. So similar, but different. So that gives us, let's just shrink this a little bit so that we can make it all fit on the one section of screen. So we can call this A, we can call this A, so AA, B, because it's a variation, and C, because it's another variation. This is the one that we had to start with. Now see there, I'm using that subdominant to leading note. So we started on C and we've ended on C. Now remember, our story cycle has to start and it has to end. And it should start on your root note and it should end on your root note. Yes, you can break that, but only if you know what you're doing. If you just start your story somewhere and end it somewhere random, Bilbo Baggins woke up in the morning, he wandered off into the woods, the end. And you're like, yeah, thanks for that. Whereas Tolkien wrote a complex story, he went lots and lots of places, but notice in the end, he came home. It's the coming home that's actually a really important part of the story. And it tells us that's going to happen right at the beginning of the story. And that's part of why it's such a successful story. Now, people go on about world building and this, that, and the other. Yes, he's done all of that, and he did a magnificent job of building this amazing world with all these creatures and what have you, and how they relate and how they don't relate. But a lot of the power in that story is because at the beginning, we have home. He goes through all these trials, but he ends up home. He's changed, but he's home. So never forget that concept. Your key note, your root note of your scale is home, and ultimately you're going to want to come back there somehow. So we transitioned from one little bit to, through the power of repetition and variation, creating ourselves, how many bars is that? A 32 bar cycle. So rather than being stuck in an 8 bar loop, which is what that was, we're now at a 32 bar loop. There's a lot more space for movement and change inside there. So that's what we had. I want to change it a little bit, so I then moved and did this. So what you're hearing there is really exactly the same thing. What I'm doing is I'm using this period to establish the theme. I'm planning for this to be a fairly long piece. I've got another piece that I wrote, which is about 12 minutes long. I'm hoping for this one to be about 12 minutes long. How long it ends up in the end, we shall see. But I'm planning for the long form, which means that I'm not racing in. If this was a 3-minute pop song, I would not be having a 32 bar intro. Way too long. I might have a 2-bar intro. But because I'm working in the long form, I'm going to allow myself plenty of space. My kind of music will tend to allow a lot of that minimal movement to try and create almost a sense of hypnotism, sleepiness. So we've just simply used a different sound. I won't go into that sound because I'm not talking about sound design in this instance. I then added a second instrument. And this instrument's a bass line, and it's designed just to really reinforce not only the core rhythm, because we can have 2 layers of rhythm. We can have our core rhythm and then our overtone rhythms, like our extra rhythms, just like you have your melody and your countermelody, which we'll get into in a mo. I added a second instrument. You'll hear it start to come in. So what that bass line is doing is what a bass line at heart is designed to do. You're going to have some very complex leading bass lines, but this one's about pinning the structure of the piece. So you can feel like it sort of ties down and it sounds big and grand, and as we move on, it actually helps make the melody and the piece in general sound big and grand. Very easy to think, oh, we're going to make it sound big and grand with drums. Get the biggest 909 samples I can find and then bit crush them and this, that and the other to make them sound supposedly even bigger. Yeah, I understand some genres, EDM, what have you, they focus more on drums than anything else, and that's okay, but that's why EDM's really always one step away from collapsing in on itself and constantly trying to find or steal new ideas to keep itself from dying. That's okay, but again, one of the major problems people get stuck in their 8-bar loop is because they focus only on drums and don't build melodies. So you'll see that I'm going to work very late on drums. It's entirely possible I get to the end of this and have minimal to no drums, but I do think I'm going to use some basic drums. But here my bass line is about tying down to remind the listener, here's the core of what's going on, so things move around it. Just as I say home, your melody moves around home. This is always keeping a sense of where home is. In medieval music, they often use what's called a ground bass. This is just a little bit of by the by, and you can do this still, which was where the bass was always only the same note. You sort of go, geez, how dull is that? But you know what? I reckon trance does that an awful lot. It's essentially a ground bass. Little by the by. So what I did, very, very simple here, I already had what becomes the bass line out here in the piano. The piano, I used the chords to make the chords for me, just because that's, at least at the moment, a supporting instrument. It's not a lead instrument, so I don't mind if it uses very basic chords. Not a big deal at all. This actually uses really exactly the same thing, because I had already decided I wanted that to be, at least for the moment, the underpinning of basic rhythm and showing where I was going. So we can add, if we go back to our main loop, we're adding in the bass line. So without it, so notice how with and without the piece changes its majesty. So adding that bass line, which is very simple but really reinforces by coming in on the important beats. It does a little bit offbeat stuff, but it's really there on the important beats and really highlighting these are the core notes of my chords. It gives the piece majesty, and that's really what we're looking for. There's been a real fashion to be anti-bombastic, or if it's bombastic, it's cheesy and no good. Me, I love cheese, but I love bombast even better. Art's supposed to be about that. It's supposed to be bigger than life. Look at this. That's a crazy looking spaceship. Who the hell would design a spaceship like that? It's not practical. But that's bombastic. And 40 years or whatever it is after the fact, 35, 40 years after the fact, I'm still wearing the t-shirt. I know it's not Star Trek, it's not the Enterprise, but that's also a ridiculous spaceship. Why on earth would you need to build it that shape? It's not practical. But it's grand, it's got majesty, it's bombastic. And that's what makes music work. And I know again that many of you, especially with EDM, are going to go, oh, but that's not cool, Benedict. Melody's not cool, being bombastic's not cool. It's like, number one, get the hell over yourself. If you've read through, and I'd encourage you to, the course of articles that I wrote on artist development, you'll see one of them is letting go of the ego. Let the song lead. I'll pick an example of an EDM track. For many of you might think it's, oh, so it's old school. But it was an EDM track that broke through, went to number one in quite a lot of places. The album couldn't carry through because they hadn't done a good enough job, honestly. And it's not just me. Read a lot of reviewers who were kind to that style of music, and they were still like, meh, as an album. But this lead track, Darude's Sandstorm, that track doesn't have a lot of melody, but it has enough, and that's why it broke through. You might think, oh, it's because it's blah. That's bombast. But they had a core melody which was just enough, just enough, and then they added their bombast into that. That's why that track broke through, and still has impact today. It still appears on, lists of the best 374 EDM tracks ever, and that's because it actually got the melody just right enough and had enough bombast in that to make it work. So don't throw that away, because you're throwing away your greatest chance of actually capturing imagination, let alone breaking through. You want to do this. You can do it subtly, or you can do it over the top. You can do something like Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds. Have a listen to that. Tremendous piece of work. If you can copy some of that and put it in your EDM track, you're winning. Sash. He had a lot of hits, and is still a respected name in EDM. Why? Because he used melody all the time. So, I added the bass line, which is adding Majesty. And that's what turned me off on the tangent, but I think it's an important tangent because that's where I see a lot of people go wrong. Add Majesty to your tracks, rather than saying I just need to add oomph to it. Because drums only add a minimal oomph. It's actually where you're adding majesty that counts. So I talked about the trance as a ground bass. It's actually the interplay between the drum and the bass that makes that work. That's what gives it majesty. So really, existing material transposed off and allowed to play a supporting role. It's a building role. I've then gone out and added a first melody, which sounds an awful lot like this. Let's just solo that. So we'll just allow its first note to play. Need to allow the first notes to play because I'm using a groove which has a lot of slop on it, and so it can often make the first notes disappear because they're essentially trying to play before the zero, just in case you're wondering why it moved backwards there. Now on its own, that melody probably isn't super strong, not entirely meant to be in this case, because it's a first idea. And the idea here is that it works with the music I've already got. So what you notice there is how it works around the existing chord progression, or if the simplest way to hear that is it's working around the bass line. Let's have a look at that again. to how this is done. What is being played in the bass line, or the chord progression, is this. So, at the point, so here, the core note, I've started on the core note, remember we do that. Now, if we're playing a chord here, it's actually going to be playing this note, and this note. Basic tritone chord. So I've picked out that note to use it as a melody note. It's a strong note. We know that that's one of the strongest notes, so we're safe to choose that. Because I'm starting the melody simply, this is not going to be a complex melody, we're not going for avant-garde experimental jazz, we're looking for simple and comfortable, reassuring. So going to this note here, the fifth, that's a nice safe note, and you know that it's actually on a relatively strong beat, which is a very strong beat. It's the first beat of the bar if we do our count. Second beat of the bar. So it's on the 3. 1, 2, 3. But that's still a relatively strong beat in the bar. And then the third note goes to our third. Remember our chord, 1, 3, 5. So on the downbeat, we've got another strong note. So very simple. It's not going to win awards for lots of notes. It's little more than arpeggio, but it creates movement, and it does so nicely. Now this is where it gets interesting. The note that's being played in the chord progression is this one. That's the G below, and I'm playing a D. How does that work? Well, if we have 1, 2, there's our tritone. It's G, B, D. So again, it's actually just using our fifth. But there's also another thing that we learn over time, is that D and G go together very nicely because it's to the fifth of it. So even though we're not playing root note here, we're playing one of the most important notes. So it's a harmonic of, and so as such it sounds really nice without being, oh, he's playing only core notes. And then I drop down to playing the root note. Again, not challenging, but you can hear the movement. So in a sense, I'm playing around with power chord and power chord. A little bit of movement in the middle, not much, but works nicely. It also works nicely in this case because you'll hear there's a lot of echo in there, so that fills that out. So as this is echoing, it's creating a kind of chord. Listen. So at that point here, as you're hearing those echoes, you're hearing some echo from here and here, as well as this note. So it's actually playing a chord at this point. This note here, as you've probably worked out by now, that's just playing the third. So I've gone 1, 5, 3, 5, 1, 3. All I've done is inverted the pattern. But the brain recognizes that. It goes, oh, it's essentially the same pattern, just moved around slightly. So it's a variation. Not a strong melody, but enough to create movement, enough to make this pleasing to listen to. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57, 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, 63, 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, 70, 71, 72, 73, 74, 75, 76, 77, 78, 79, 80, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, 88, 89, 90, 91, 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, 100, 101, 102, 103, 104, 105, 106, 107, 108, 109, 110, 111, 112, 113, 114, 115, 116, 117, 118, 119, 120, Now we start to move forward a little bit, because if we only do what I've done here, it's going to get dull. We do not want that to get dull. We need to create that little bit of interest. EDM often does that by trying to say, oh, we'll just chop it up. But it's not interesting enough. It's a clever thing to do, but you need to move melodically as well. Because otherwise just going, oh, I'm going to just keep playing the same note, and then go... By now you're starting to think, it's really not very good at it. And you're right, because we need some movement. That up on the spot, won't pretend it's good, but it's better than what I played before. You've moved from one note with a trick to many notes with a trick, which is better than having either of those alone. So we're on a main beat, and this is a point, remember, where the chord progression moves fairly quickly. At this point it goes to the leading note, but we're not going back home, we're not at the end, we're just hinting, and then it's going to go to the A. So here it's on B, and really I've done exactly what I've done before here. Straight away you should be able to work that root, third and fifth. So I've just walked them down, which is a variation of what I've done here, only rather than going in a curve, I've just gone in a straight line. But I've also used, here we've got long, long, very long, 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 very long. I've done that twice. Need to be careful doing it a third time. Whereas here I've got pretty short, still kind of short, and then moves to a long. Now it's important what note I play here, because this is actually the changing of a chord. What note have I got? I've got a C. What am I actually playing as a root note at this point? I'm playing an A. The relationship between A and C is it's a third. It's still an important note, so that works okay. So I then work around just by playing the extra notes. Again, we're still only using what's called chord notes. So if a chord is 1, 3, 5, every single note you see in here is still a chord note. I'm only playing the 1, 3, the 5. It's a very simple way to create melodies. It's a limited way, because you've only got 3 notes to use. Of course, you can use the octave up and the octave down and what have you, but you've got to work your way to and from them. Don't just leap octaves. It's dangerous. It can be great, but it can be very dangerous. Your melody can sound very disconnected. And then I create a sort of a half an arpeggio again, just by going third, fifth. Remember, the bass is handling the fundamental of this chord. I then show that there and go up to the third. And remember here, that's the root note of our whole piece as well. That's part of why it's also a strong note. The fact that it happens to be the root note makes that note stronger than if it was just the third. So it's the third, and in this case the root note. So it strengthens the piece. So we'll run through this again. So listen to that and hear how the bass is giving us just the core of our chord progression, and then the melody Very loose melody, almost more an ostinato, but we're not going to get too technical. It just works around it a little bit. Towards the end it doesn't do a lot. That's just because we're going to say that most of our melody is here, and this is just sort of marking time. A little like a drum roll at the end of a pattern, a longer pattern. That's just a way of sort of easing out. You can release tension with that, or you can just ease through. You don't always want your melody to be full on and complex and intricate the whole way through, because you tire people out. Now we run through the same thing again. Remember, these first two sections were actually the same, and if we look, they are same until we get to here, and then they're different. So let's see what happens here. So this melody is actually a variation on our core chord progression. And this little bit here creates a variation on top of that. So the great thing with variations is that you can keep creating variations on top of variations on top of variations. And that's what classical music does, or orchestral music does. It starts with a core theme, so often at the beginning of the piece you'll hear the flute or something play your core theme. Exactly what I've walked you through here. You'll then hear that theme being played by other instruments, and they'll start to play around with it. Some notes will get moved, some of the timing will get changed, and that's creating variations, and you can create variation on variation on variation on variation on variation. It's like breeding. Each critter that you spit out is related to the first critter, but each one increasingly moves on. So you can breed in or out certain traits. So this is the third section. And you notice now that we introduced this quick run here, and we've echoed it here. Here, it's in an eighth note. Here, it goes in the opposite direction, but it's in a one beat note, so it's 4/16. The brain recognizes the relationship between the two of them. Just like you can look at a son or a grandson and see an echo of father and grandfather. This is created something. It was just a little passing something, but we've echoed it here, and that creates a familiarity. It's a little bit more adventurous than the first variations. So what I've done is I'm still using clearly the 1-3-5 model, but that one is not. Remember, if we're working in C major, D is a second. That's not a strong note. But you notice here it's in passing. But by introducing that, suddenly it's added an extra, little bit more excitement. We've got a little bit more movement here. We're starting to get jiggy with it. And again there. It's pretty minor, but you notice how it shakes up the piece. So if we were to take from here, notice how in this section the basic chord progression sort of rises a little bit. It's like, ooh, just going to pick up a little bit. There's a little bit of excitement happening. And so I've made our basic melody echo that as well by just breaking out of the very basic pattern that we've used here and adding a little bit more to it. That's a variation of a variation. Now we've got our final bit, which is going to work towards resolution. So remember that was a variation, and this one, the chord progression was quite simply G, A, leading, root. So we've got a little of what we did in the first version, which was very simple and clear, and a little bit of this, but we don't want to overstate this, because remember that's sort of the peak. Two-thirds of the way through should always be kind of the peak of what you're doing. So this restates some of what we've done using those still first, third, fifth movements, because remember our first is here, and we're playing that and that. So still first, third, fifth, playing with those. That's A, and we're playing a C. So that's still a fifth, and there's the A down below, so it's a fair drop. Again, that's power chord. And that's our middle note. That echoes these faster notes that we had in here. And that's a very simple arpeggio. You can see it. 1, 3, 5. 1, 3. But we're going to go back onto 1, because remember that's home. We could use 5, but this is the end of that whole cycle, our 32 bars. So it's probably better to go back to 1, because there's a reasonable chance that what we're going to do is actually loop that, go around again. You can change that, and there will be times where you will change that, and you'll need to change that based on what's coming next. Lead to what's coming next. If you make each of your sections purely self-contained. Now I'm using blocks here, not because I've written in blocks, merely to make it really clear so that you can see and I can see when I'm talking and my brain's on other things where each of the sections is. If you make each of your blocks complete in itself and then just butt them up against each other, you will have problems with transition, because they'll sound great on their own as they loop, but you'll have difficulties with as you transition from one block to another. Doesn't mean it can't work, but it does mean that as you start to get a little bit more complex, it won't work. In which case, it's great to write your block, but then be flexible, come back and listen to it, and go, well, hang on, I'd probably be better if I lead up to where I'm going on the next block, especially if the block that comes next has a slightly different chord progression. In this case, I know that we're going back to the same place, so we're starting on C. But if we're starting the next one on, let's say A, between C and A is a fair leap. So if I've gone back to, it's a bit of a leap. Whereas if I went, I'm not claiming that's wonderful, but here how the transition is just a little easier. So even though we're finishing on our fifth instead of our first, it's actually becoming a leading note to where we're going next. So that's where you start to become flexible, and those rules adapt. That's why when you get into theory, you find that there are a trillion different rules. But don't worry about them, but just understand that they're there to cover situations like that, so that you don't end up going, because it's just a big leap that makes little sense. Whereas if you can transition, it now becomes seamless. Right, now we start to get a little bit more inventive. We've got everything that we had before, but now we're adding a second melody. Let's just solo this. Again, not super strong on its own. It's not a melody that we're going to go home singing. I'm not super strong on making really tight little melodies. I'm not Bjorn and Betty from ABBA, but this will work within the context of my piece. Now, you know how I've made this, because I've already explained it. The reason I played it through both halves of it was to see if you could naturally recognize and work out and see how I've done it and see how I've got repetition in there. Let's pop it all back together. Looking at the block up here, you probably notice that it's second melody, which is this one. There's our first melody there, here's our second melody here. But I also say and tension. As you've heard me say before, music is about tension and release. So all good art builds up tension and then you let it go. And yes, that does relate to what you're thinking about as well. Relax, don't do it. When you want to do it, relax. You can work that out, I'm sure. It's a fundamental part of life, so use it. You're mad if you don't, simply because your art won't work. So you build up tension. What we're doing here is actually using a counter melody. I've got two melodies which are working around each other. Now, somebody who's a lot better at making melodies than me would probably be able to tell me in 12 seconds how I stuffed it and could have done a better job. I agree with you. Even without hearing you, I agree with you. But this works, and I'm not unhappy with it. Matter of fact, I'm rather pleased with it, because I've actually managed to achieve something without trying, which reminds me of, and I definitely wasn't trying to steal it, but it reminds me of something done by Vangelis. That's cool in my book. It's going to stay as an homage, and also because I think it's great. And I'm intrigued because it lets me know oh, it sounds really full-on and complex and grand and amazing when he did it. But you know what, it's actually quite simple when I did it. Not that I was setting out to do it, it just worked out that way. Part of the reason that these things work out that way, and you'll find that you will write things which will be a little bit like Nine Inch Nails, or a bit like Metallica, or a bit like Cannibal Corpse, or whoever it is that you're steeped in, because your brain has learnt those patterns, so it'll regurgitate those patterns. We can get all complex and legal and say it's plagiarism, but it's only really plagiarism when you deliberately set out to steal it. When you say, here's a Marvin Gaye song, it was really cool, I don't really want to sit down and write my own song, I'm just going to basically steal it, but it's not going to be an homage, I'm just going to steal it. Not cool. That is plagiarism. Because you didn't write your own piece, you just basically stole somebody else's, when you really coulda, shoulda, woulda just done a cover, or made something that was based around it. I didn't set out to do that here, but it fitted in and it worked out. It's an homage. Not trying to get myself off any kind of legality, it was just, once I got to the end of it, I thought, this is kind of, and it's like, yep, okay, I get where that came from. But those things will come out because they're your grounding. Just like you will tend to copy your parents, whether you mean to or not, this is your grounding, it will come out. Just make sure that you're aware of the difference between homage and plagiarism. Music is full of us borrowing and building on something somebody else did. You have to do it, don't shy away from it, but don't step across that line from saying, oh, okay, I'm going to build on that idea that I found in Vangelis, Jarre, Gorguts, Bathory. I'm going to build on that and do something of my own with it, between sort of saying, oh, well, I'm going to use exactly the same chord progression, I'm going to use exactly the same melody, but I'm just going to pretend I wrote something different. Sucky. And it also is lazy because it means you're not learning. If you're going to do that, do a cover. Be honest. Do a cover. And that way, nobody's gunning for you. You have shown your fascination, your interest on your sleeve, and very proudly. People may even be impressed. They sort of say, oh, gee, you know, you've done a cool Bathory cover. Nice way to pick up people. So, do covers to learn how somebody else made it work. Do homages when you're fascinated by that idea and want to build something of your own on it. A little bit of a sidetrack there, but it's an important thing once you start to work. So let's go have a wee looky at our second melody. Now when I wrote this, I'd actually turned the first melody off. So I didn't know whether the two of them were going to go together or not. It wasn't entirely a plan, it was just I'm going to write a second melody. So this is what I wrote. Remember, we've got exactly the same chord progression. Guess what? That's our chord progression. But it's up here that we've shown a little bit of variety. We've gone 1, 3. That backs what we did with the other melody. Then we've gone to this. Ooh. That's different because it's not part of that. Where are we at here? G and D? Oh, hang on, no, we are actually safe. Because remember, that's the fifth. But because the ear is now following this more than this, that note's interesting. But it's a move, a small move here, when we've got a relatively large move here, and that's actually the thing. It's that transition that's something that Vangelis has done quite a few times, and I've got to say it works beautifully. There's a huge majesty in that. And that's part of what you learn when you do these things. You go, oh wow, cool, that works really well. The reason I love Bach, and so many people like Bach, is because he could do amazing things with 2 notes. Just the way that he would move the 2 notes together in a 2-part invention. You're like, man, that is amazing. The sound is cool. It's just that little transition. If we took just those 2 notes, pretty. But it's the difference in the harmonies that make it work. And there I've again just gone to the fundamental of that chord. So quite simple. It's just that little bit of passing there that makes it work. Like I say, accidental, but wonderful. Got a B and a B, so that's root, 3rd. That's kind of odd. So we've got a B and a C. But interestingly enough, and there'd be some reason why, this actually sounds more like a resolution, and that's great. This is a resolution here, and this sounds like a resolution here. Now here you will notice that I've got my main beat here, but I've carried that note over, and then I'm starting my next melodic run a bit off. There were a couple of things that I could have done. I could have had that note start there, but then I'm repeating a note, and sometimes repeating a note is good. Sometimes repeating a note actually makes it sound weaker. So in this case, the reason this works is because, as you'll hear, while something happens on the downbeat, there's more happens here. So it's better to just carry that note across to give it the strength of the bass line underneath. Resolution, but a strange one, I got to say. So we've got what appears to be our root. Actually, no, it's not our root, because our root at this point was... Yeah, so I've started to wander away. That's why this sounds a little less clear, because I've actually started to wander away. So far, everything has followed the root note of my chord progression. Here I've started to move away and do other things. So it's a variation of a variation. It's gotten separated from the first. It's not as strong, but that's part of what works. I'll do things like this partly because I'm not a great composer, and partly because in this case I've used a phased sound. Phases work best, not necessarily when you're giving them straight simple material, but when you give them harmonically interesting material, then the phaser somehow becomes, it's got more chew to it. So yes, this is harmonically a little bit more interesting than what we did before, which was very, very close to the chord progression. This is related to it, but a little bit wandering away, and it highlights the phaser sound. So that's part of why I allow it to go this way, but it's also part of the excuse. I did talk about here not repeating, but here I have repeated because we're carrying the same note across, and initially I did carry it across because it's like, well, there's no point repeating it, but then when I listened to it, it just made that beat stronger to have that note breathe again. Otherwise it just sounded like it starts here and then it runs out a puff through here, which means that we actually detract from the beat. So I've finished the note, I've taken a little bit off the end of it so that they don't overlap each other. If they overlap each other too much, especially with a strong amount of slop on the timing, then chances are the second note wouldn't play at all. Even if you're not using something to humanize or slop your timing, it's still well worth creating a little bit of a gap, especially with stringy or paddy sounds, because otherwise what happens is that this one doesn't start to decay until the other one's starting. Sometimes that works okay, but often it means that you don't get that breath. If that was a singer singing, it's like I've sung quite a few words and now I need to sing quite a few more words. You've run out of breath. Like I said, that's part of the problem of leaving it run. So you sing a couple of words and suck in some air, and then that gives you more breath to sing some more words. I hope that makes sense to you, but you'll hear it. Sometimes you'll sort of go, oh, it's worth chopping that note in half, shaving a little off the end of that one and having it start again, because it gives you a bloom, which actually strengthens your rhythm as well as strengthening your melody. So I had that. This is a variation of that because remember the first two parts of the chord progression were the same, so that is the first two. This covers 3 and 4. I've copied the pattern to some extent. Again, most of this is not super strong. This is not as dramatic as the first little part of the last one. But if you make everything dramatic all the time, then it's just... and there's no joy in it at all. So be careful. You've got to have your tension, your release, your light and your shade. And here we're playing with Countermelody. So if we turned off, we've got our Moog, which is just doing the very basic melody, but let's go back. How that changes. In some ways it's become stronger because it's not fighting with or working around something else. Even though that's a very simple melody, it still does affect what we're doing. So the two work together. That's why they're called counter melody. So it's like two people creating a discussion and adding their points into the pot. That's part of why, remember, I call this second melody and tension. So we are building tension by having these things work around each other. So not as strong through here, but supporting in this role, but quite pleasant on its own. And then towards the end, we do need a reasonable resolution because it is coming to the end of this section. Well, that's nice. Boom, boom, boom. It rises, so it's important for us to build that strength there. Most likely we're getting back to root note and triad notes, so our chord notes. And I know this finishes on C, so we've got our leading note, B, which goes up to C. Remember, we're actually in D major, but I'm going to work in C and let the computer do the math for us. So we've got E and F. Oh no, so B and C, B and C. So that's right back to, the reason that suddenly sounds strong and grand is because that's actually just quite simply playing our core notes, and it's our leading to our unison. That's why that sounds nice and clear. So we're now on C. I've got G, which is a fifth. I've got E, which is our third. So that's actually our chord right there. 1, 2, oh, wrong button. Even though it's spread out, that's just good old-fashioned triad chord. I've added another note in there, which is an F. Because you need that to walk down. So that gives a really nice finish to that section. Cool. So we put them together, and we've got So we've actually got 3 melodies working together. We've got actually I forgot. I've actually copied the melody from this one here, which was what I called our first melody. Because remember, here the Moogie sound was just playing. Forgive me as I try to remember this. It's been overnight. That was where it was playing very simple line, and here I've copied across this. So we'll just highlight the 2 of these because it's just going to help you understand when I explain what's happening here. So my apologies. Basically what we do is we're running our 2 melodies. So we've built our first melody and our second melody. What we have here is kind of a melody, but it's really just stating the chord progression. So I didn't count it as a melody. So we've got that first melody, which I've called the bright instrument, and the second melody, which is on the phase string, and they're playing against each other. So it's melody and countermelody, and by the 2 of them playing together, they're creating a kind of tension because they're similar, but it's like brothers or sisters who sort of just they never hate each other, but they're constantly sort of at each other all the time. So this is what's happening at this point. And mix-wise, I'm aware of that. I've got our bass, of course, in the center. Our piano, because it's also forming a kind of bass or a fundamental role there, it's holding down the chord progression. And our Moogie line is also in the centre. They're being sort of the core of the piece. The extra melodies, we've got Bright, which has moved slightly to one side, or that side, seeing that's where it's pointing. And the phase string is a little on the other side. I don't want a hard pan then. It's not Tipton and Downing in a Judas Priest song. I just want to create a little bit of movement. As I composed them, they were in the centre, but I know mix-wise it's going to be a little easier on the ear if they're left and right. Because it says to the listener, it says to the brain, we are playing two things at once, like tennis. You know, we've got a little bit of a struggle here. So the struggle goes on, gets to the end of itself. Now, if I wanted to, I could actually call that the end of this piece. It's 4 minutes long. That's decent enough length. A few little extra bits and pieces. We could tighten it up, call it a whole piece. Because it's actually got everything we need to be a whole piece. But as I said to you at the beginning, I'm aiming for more like 12 minutes. I'm aiming for long form. Plus, it's going to allow me to show you more stuff. But I'm aiming for long form here. But this covers everything we need. We've got a core of what we're doing, which is our chord progression, which I've also played out like a little melody. We've got a first actual variation of that melody. Remember, this core melody is made up of A, B, and C, so we've got two variations there already. We've got a variation of that, so we've taken what's here as being, say, A again, and this is a B to its A. It's a variation of it. And then this here is a C, because it's a variation of this, which is a variation of this. So we've actually got one core idea, but two spin-offs from that. Chief, a couple of Indians, their big discussion about, you know, whether they are or aren't going to go put arrows in the cowboys. That's your tension here, that argument, and a resolution. I liked this that much. I decided that was going to be the outcome. This guy won the fight. But rather than there being any sore losers, I've now got all of these instruments. So this instrument, and this instrument, which are our three lead instruments, all playing the same melody. So they've said, okay, we all agree, we're all one big happy family, and we're marching off to do whatever it is we decided to do. Yes, the piece simplifies at this point, but that's great. It's resolution. It's saying we're all doing this thing. If I were tidying up and finishing this piece right now, yes, I probably would add some drums and sound effects, some little bits and pieces, just to roll everything along. But we'll deal with that a little later, because that's not where I'm going. And also here, this could finish very nicely here because it's a nice ending. Nice ending because we came home. Now that one's on an E, and home is a C. But our piano, which is holding down our chords, is on a C. Our instrument's not playing at that point. This is playing a C and an E, as is this. So we're showing our root note very strongly. We're showing us an overtone of it, and it's often quite nice for a monophonic sound or a lead sound that's not necessarily in the whole lead mode to finish using one of the harmonics, which in this case is normally the third or the fifth. It just kind of gives a nice sound. It just gives a little bit of brightness and bite, mystery, whatever, to that sound. These are the tricks that you learn. But basically what we've done is we've started back here. First note you hear is a C. Is your C. That's why we could actually call this piece musically complete. But as I said, I'm not going to because I want to do more with it. And it's also going to allow me to show you more, but I want to do more with it because I want a 12-minute piece.